right? There's no rule that says if something's written in kind of a poetic fashion that it's myth or it's not true. When you start drilling down to the usage of the Hebrew words and what the function was for each of these days, that parallelism is actually very, very strong. And yet it clearly has elements of narrative prose, and it clearly has elements of poetry. Now, there are going to be some people that are going to react because of describing things like the rich usage of poetic language. That, if one is dead set on defending Genesis 1 as simply a scientific text or a journalistic report, then there's kind of a reaction or pushback against anything that smacks of poetic language.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's like, I mean, who are we to say that the original writer couldn't have added multiple layers to the text so you could have one specifically historical or scientific text, but also additional meaning to it?
Right. Yeah, and we actually get into that in the introduction to the book,
Mm.
where, in talking about like the history of Sarah and Hagar, that, it's you read it in Genesis and it just looks like a narrative story. And then we ask, well, what if somebody came along and said, well, you can interpret that as an analogy too? And, people would probably react saying, no, 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 it's just narrative. It's just history. And then you say, well, but it was the Apostle Paul that said that in Galatians, that you can understand the story to be an analogy, which doesn't stop it from being a historical account, but it just means that it's deeper than just a journalistic report.
Yeah, completely. Okay, so can you give us can you go into your layer of Genesis 1 as a song and just give your evidence for why you think that it should be read that way?
Sure. So going into this one, because it does draw on this rich use of poetic language, I think it's important to step back from the specific understanding of Genesis to just this idea of what does it mean for the Bible to be true, right? Because that's ultimately that's what many Christians' concern is. Like, are you suggesting that this was not true or not historical? Uh, Up until like the 16th and 17th centuries, there was not a general Christian scholarly consensus or thought of Genesis 1 being a scientific document. It wasn't until the rise of humanistic thinking and the scientific revolution where people started to argue that, the highest form of communicating truth is scientific or journalistic. And as products of that Western culture, we often don't realize how influenced we are by that, where we have this sort of unconscious thought that, okay, well, if scientific and journalistic writing is the highest form of communicating truth, the Bible must be a scientific journalistic report. And we don't realize that what we're doing is defending the Bible by secularizing it, that we're robbing it of its historical context and the culture into which it was written. So if we kind of do this gut check and say, all right, let me not impose my 21st century Western mindset on the text. Let me back away from that and actually try to dive in and understand this from the perspective of the people that were receiving it. And when we do that, one of the things we realize is that there was an amazing usage of poetic language in the recording of Scripture. By some estimates, over a third of the Bible is written in some kind of poetic form, which is not the same thing as saying it's not true, right? There's no rule that says if something's written in kind of a poetic fashion that it's myth or it's not true. It's just a different way of describing things. The only thing that recognition should do is make us like shy away a little bit from over interpreting certain words, so that we recognize that there can be rich symbolism and literary kind of literary language that we find. So looking at Genesis in that light, one of the things that is, one of the first things that we would see is things like the rich use of the number 7, not just in recording a number, but in its symbolic representation of things that are perfect. In looking at the, of course, the days of creation, there's 7, but looking at the initial declaration of Genesis 1:1, it does so in 7 Hebrew words. The second declaration of being formless and void and God's spirit hovering over the waters is 14 Hebrew words, 2 times 7. And then we have all of these multiples of 7 in the usage of it was so, it was good, the firmament and heavens, the earth, reference to God, that all of them occur in sets of 7. The final summary statement, Genesis 2:1-3, is 35 words, which is 5 sets of 7. So just seeing that by itself immediately tells us that there's rich symbolism that's in this text, and that's probably not the only thing that we're going to find. Uh, when we look at the structure of the days, there is a remarkable parallel where we've got 3 days. Well, actually, I got to back up a second. Before we get into the days, we get this Hebrew expression of tohu vabohu. So we've got rhyming words that are translated as formless and empty, or formless and void, and they rhyme. So we got this wordplay that sets up then 3 days of solving the formless problem, where we have the creation of the realm of light and dark, the realm of sea and sky, the realm of land with plants. And then we have this parallel set of days where it's solving the empty problem, where we're filling the realm of light and dark with sun, moon, and stars. We're filling the realm of sea and sky with fish and birds, and we're filling the realm of land with animals and then humans. Uh, if we get into the structure of the repetition within each day, we see that there's this set of, God said, let there be something, followed by, and there was. Eventually, we see God says, it was good. And then there's evening and morning that ends a day. Well, we see that repeated in each of the days, but in day 3, we get a duplicate set of those. So we get 2 sets of God said, let, it was so, God saw that it was good. And in day 6, we get 2 replicates of that. So it looks like you've got this structure that's very intentional, where you've got our 3 days of solving the formless problem that end with day 3 having this duplicate set of these expressions, and then the 3 parallel days of solving the empty problem that's also then ended with this duplicate set of these expressions, so that it's like the writer's being very intentional about letting us know that these are in fact parallel days, that they, perhaps could also be interpreted as being sequential, but they are so much more deep. There's so much more there than just a sequence of days.
Hey chat, subscribing to our YouTube channel allows us to help our watchers understand the Bible better. Thanks to your help, we have already reached thousands of people in their walk with Christ. If you'd like to help further our efforts, tap the subscribe button, which will allow us to reach even more people.
You forgot to tell them to turn on bell notifications.
Wait, they have to subscribe and click a bell now?
Awesome, wonderful stuff. So, so I guess my question for you would be, so you have all these, this odd structure. We have this repetition. At what point do you get to from that to, okay, this might have been read as a song?
So that kind of gets back to, how do we define a song? And we're not making a case that, there was a melody and that it was sung kind of like we think of it as going to church and singing. That there are cultures where a poetic reading is thought of as something approaching a hymn or a song or a liturgy, and that's really what we're after here, more than they there was a melody and there was a harmony.
That makes sense. Okay. And do we have any other passages in the Bible that are used in this way?
Uh, so there's yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there are many places in Scripture where stories are related in a poetic fashion and might even be called a song. So you get like the Song of Moses after the uh, the the parting of the Red Sea and the Egyptian soldiers were overwhelmed. That's written as a song, rich in poetic language. You have the Song of Deborah that after in Judges when Sisera and his army were defeated, and Deborah sings a song that also it's recording actual history and commemorating actual history, but it's written in with poetic language, saying things, even things like the stars joined in to the battle against Sisera, and I don't know of any Hebrew scholars today that would try to argue that the actual stars came down and were making battle against Sisera. Um, but it's the idea that God and all of the resources of nature are coming together to achieve this victory on behalf of Israel.
Okay. Yeah. And I know there's been talk about you have other creation texts from other cultures being used as some type of liturgy or in their temple. And English was recited yearly. A lot of scholars think in their temple. Do you have any thoughts on that in regards to Genesis?
Well, there's certainly strong evidence that it was read in the temple. I mean, Scripture itself, when the Israelites are being commanded on how to understand these texts that are being given to them, are told to read them in the temple on at least an annual basis. And that one's interesting because when we talk about the idea of there being multiple overlapping layers, that you also see this when we start talking about the covenant and the idea that it mimics the treaties, that the treaties were also in this time frame were documents that were provided and expected to be read with some repetition in the local temple. So you have some overlap in that sense too. When the Israelites are being commanded on how to understand these texts that are being given to them, are told to read them in the temple on at least an annual basis. And that one's interesting because when we talk about the idea of there being multiple overlapping layers, that you also see this when we start talking about the covenant and the idea that it mimics the treaties, that the treaties were also in this time frame were documents that were provided and expected to be read with some repetition in the local temple. So you have some overlap in that sense too.
Oh, no, that's interesting. Okay. All right. And you briefly talked about it, but do you have like a final say on whether it's poetry or prose?
Do I have?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I don't know that I would claim to be able to dictate, what it is and what it isn't. But if you're asking me my sense, and based on Hebrew scholars writing on the subject, and of course lots of input from my co-author, the answer to the question of is it poetry or is it prose, the answer is yes. It has elements of both. Uh, when people are discussing the appropriate genre of Genesis 1, a lot of ink has been spilt by some that, in an effort to say that it is strictly a narrative prose, will correctly note that there is no other place in Scripture that looks exactly like the like Genesis 1. that what we think of as classical Hebrew poetry is not found replicated in Genesis 1. What is often left out is that there's no other place in that replicates Genesis 1 as just narrative prose either. That there is a uniqueness to the style and to the genre of Genesis 1 that has elements of narrative prose and has elements of poetry. And I think one of the strongest examples of the poetic nature is that in Hebrew culture and Hebrew poetry, they use a lot of parallelism. Now, in classical Hebrew poetry, that parallelism tends to be fairly tight, and you'll see it like within a specific verse. Whereas in Genesis 1, we definitely see that parallelism. I mean, that's the whole structure of the days 1 through 3 and days 4 through 6 have obvious parallels to them. But it's not as tight as you find in classical Hebrew poetry. So that has led many scholars to identify Genesis 1 as basically a unique genre, where it's, they use the Latin term sui generis, which is basically means it's a unique genre.
Okay, so typically, from what I've seen at least, is that we read the Bible, we almost categorize it in 4 or 5 different genres. Yeah, poetic, prose, sometimes apocalyptic, and all these other ones. But that, as you said, it's almost like you're saying that Genesis 1 is its own genre. But at the same time, like how can you say oh, it's its own genre? Like, why would this specific one be so different than all the other ones? Like,
right?
How can you almost make up your own genre?
Right. This is a good question. So, and if Ken Turner were joining us on this conversation, this would be the point where I would say, "All right, Ken, take it away." He's not here, so I have to answer the question. It's not about looking at it and imposing an understanding on the text, right? We want the text to speak to us. And when we look at Genesis 1 and we don't find the style of narrative prose anywhere else in Scripture, and we don't find the style of poetic language specifically in any other place in Scripture. And yet it clearly has elements of narrative prose, and it clearly has elements of poetry, particularly the Hebrew use of parallelism. So that leaves us with a understanding or recognition that this is a unique text that is not replicated anywhere else in Scripture in terms of its genre. Now, why would that be? We can only speculate, right? So my thoughts on it are that this could be a result of this is a story that is the first of all stories. It likely was initially passed down through oral tradition, and so by the time you get to Moses, who is then recording this story, he's not necessarily just replicating an oral tradition, right? He's capturing the creation story for a people at that time. That includes a lot of knowledge of all these pagan religions around them that then comes into play in the polemic layer, where the creation story is not told in a vacuum, right? It's told with this understanding and coming out of Egypt and having been influenced by all of these pagan beliefs. So, but as the first of all stories in this oral tradition, it's possible that some of the genre is preserved from those earlier times. So but that's just speculation. Another possibility is that there's just an intentional writing of the story in such a way that it does stand by itself and doesn't just match any other genre in the entire rest of the Bible.
Yeah, I would actually, I've spoken up with a lot of well-educated people on this topic, and I've heard a lot of people say that this is a very complicated, fascinating. Like Genesis 1 is almost nothing like it else in the ancient Near East. Like with all these different layers, and you have the poetic elements, but also these prose elements. It's very fascinating. So you mentioned the structure of, you have days 1 and 3, and then you have 4 and 6, but 4 to 6. But then, uh, it seems like you say that they parallel, but then if the luminaries of day 4 were placed in the heavens, that's day 2, and then fish from day 5 are placed in the seas of day 3, or the water made prior to day 1. Like, it seems like it doesn't exactly fit perfectly. Can you help explain your view on that?
Yes, and so and this is a good place to point out that in the book we end each one of the layers with potential objections, either objections that have been published by others for a particular understanding, or sometimes we've tried to anticipate what some of the objections might be. So this is one of those examples where people have published objections to this idea of the parallel structure, where they've argued that the sun, moon, and stars of day 3 are actually filling the realm of day 2 in the firmament, not day 1, and that the fish of day 4 are actually placed in water from day 3, or maybe even the waters before day 1, the waters of the deep, and try to discount the parallel structure. I honestly don't know why people would go to such lengths to try to undermine the beauty of this text. But that said, what's very helpful is if we actually pay attention to the Hebrew words that are found in the text, and rather than just think about things that are mentioned, to actually think about the purpose. What was the purpose of each of the days? That table 3 in the book breaks up the 6 days with highlighting some of these Hebrew words and what the function or purpose was. So in day 1, we have the light separated from darkness, uh, and then in day 4, where you have the sun, moon, and stars, they're not just dropped into something; that they have a purpose. And day 4 explicitly says their purpose is to separate day from night. So you've got day 1 saying light and dark to separate day and night, light from dark. You've got day 4 that's repeating that phrase. So you definitely have a parallelism there. You move into the days 2 and 5, and it's interesting that there's 2 different words in Hebrew for waters and sea. It's not the same word that's just repeated. And I may not be pronouncing the Hebrew exactly right, but you have Mayim, translated as waters, and Yamim, translated as sea. And when you're looking at the word choice in day 2, when it's separating the waters above from the waters below is that Mayim. You look at day 5, when the fish are created, they are not put in Yamim, they are put in Mayim. So it's the same Hebrew word that's used back in day 2 that gives us this clear connection that the fish are being created to solve the empty sea problem, right? We had day 2 creating the realms of sea and sky. You have day 5 then filling the sea and sky with fish and birds, and that same word Mayim is used in both. And then when you get down to days 3 and 6, that's where you see the Hebrew word Yamim in both day 3 and day 6, that makes it clearer that there's that parallel is also supported. So when you start drilling down to the usage of the Hebrew words and what the function was for each of these days, that parallelism is actually very, very strong.
Great, yeah. And So I just wanted to summarize all you said and maybe add a little bit that you mentioned in the book. So you have the sevens. You have a whole bunch of different sevens in the text. You have the parallel structure of 1 to 3 and 4 and 6. You have tohu wabohu, those rhyming words at the very beginning. You have repeating patterns of phrases all throughout. You have an opening and closing stanza as they're paralleled at the beginning and the end, as well as you have God did or God said. You have 31 times, which it's just not expected in some type of prose, as typically it'd be something like Abraham said and then he did it, or then he did it. Like it's this weird verbiage and nouns used there. So
Yeah, and I'll
yeah.
leave you with a teaser that that when you're looking at the repetition of phrases in each of the days, that there is this apparent oddity in days 2 and 5, where in each one of those a phrase is left out, and it turns out to be very intentional and built around where the writer wanted to use the word good, where he uses it 7 times, and rather than just dropping it into one place in each of the 7 days, he ends day 3 with 2 uses of the word good. He ends day 6 with 2 uses of the word good, which means he has to leave it out of one of the other days. And you can read the book and look at the table to see how fascinating and obviously intentional that structure is.
Hey you, yeah you, hit the button on the screen. It's the full interview of the video just watched. Come on, you know this is a good one, just do it.